prisons in America are secret, and they are running without accountability and without the public's knowledge. The difference in Alabama is that we could actually see what's happening, and there were some incredibly brave people, some brave men who were incarcerated, and some brave mothers and family members on the outside who allowed us to follow along and tell their story. But there could be, we hope that other journalists and filmmakers will look into other states and do this similar reporting so that we can tackle this national issue.
That's the sound of an American oil company. You asked a question about things that surprised us, and I would say one thing that really opened our eyes was the fact that they are willing to let many inmates go out into the communities and work. And, maybe everybody understands that if you're incarcerated, maybe it's a good idea that you have to sweep the floor or help save taxpayers some money on your incarceration. But nobody really understands that the prisoners are often the only people to perform critical tasks. In the film, you see that the drug counselor left his job in frustration, and one of the inmates took over the rehabilitation effort. Somebody who's untrained, very good-natured, and wants to help these people, but actually doesn't know where all the federal money is going that is supposed to go into the rehabilitation effort, and especially drug treatment. The thing that we were maybe most surprised by is they're not just sent out to work at the governor's mansion or on a road crew or construction or sanitation, but they're actually leased out to corporations, McDonald's or the Hyundai parts distributor, or places like Bama Budweiser. These are places that are companies who are using incarcerated labor, and it's essentially forced labor because if you have 1 minute left. Katie Ivey's even talked about criminalizing not working, and it doesn't mean that people want to be lazy. They would love to go out into the community, but the most surprising fact is that people who are deemed safe enough to work in the community are, during certain periods of time, less likely to be paroled than the people who are at the next highest custody level. So whether the state is consciously aware of it or not, or whether the government is aware of it or not, they've created a situation where the more valuable somebody is to work outside in the community, the less likely they are to have any hope to come home.
Yeah, so I'm going to comment on the prison labor. I know a lot of people have heard me say this many times, but you have to look at the history to understand why things are the way they are today, right? What they were talking about in Alabama with the forced labor is just a contemporary form of convict leasing. At the end of abolition, at the end of plantation slavery, when the Black Code was adopted in order to put Black people in the prison system, the system came up with convict leasing. And what this was they wanted to figure out a way to bring Black people from the plantations into the prisons and then have a way to return them back to the plantations, right? And so they came up with this thing called convict leasing. And what it was that since the person, the individual, could no longer own another person, right? The plantation slavery was abolished, and so individuals couldn't own you. The state was able to take ownership, and this was through the 13th Amendment. So they transferred the ownership of the person from the individual plantation owner to the state. Now, the state adopted this practice where the individual plantation owner can now lease you back from the prisons to go work on a plantation. And so it was a way for everybody to make money except the Black person. So when we look at what's going on with the slave labor, because that's what it is, that you see happening in Alabama with incarcerated people there, it's just a use of the 13th Amendment. So And I'm going to quote, and I know many people have heard me quote this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment whereof the party shall have been duly convicted of the crime, shall exist in the United States or any territory subject to its jurisdiction. That's the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, right? And what they did, that's the document that abolished plantation slavery to allegedly, and I'm air quoting, free black people. The problem with that document is it never said black people was free. There's not a inkling of a language in that law that says black people are free, right? What it says is slavery couldn't exist except for a condition. So the very document that supposedly had free black people immediately instituted an exception clause, right? When you see something in legal language that says except for, right, that's an exception clause. And the exception clause lays out a particular condition. The condition is if a person is convicted of a crime. So slavery can exist. What the exception clause says is slavery can exist if the person is convicted, right? So now, what's the strategy of that? Now they adopted these black codes, and these black codes became specific laws, rules of the states that only black people can violate. Nobody else can violate these laws. Only black people. And black people were being convicted at just remarkable rates to be put back into the prison system. And then, they were leased back to the plantations. So the 13th Amendment paved the way for slavery to continue in America even till today. That language is still there. It's still valid. That language is the reason why they can have this forced labor in Alabama. It's the reason why all over the United States, they can pay a person $1 a day to slave inside of the prison. It's every single thing that's done inside the prison, from maintenance. You got a busted pipe. It's incarcerated people who are going to come and repair it. You got broken bricks on a sidewalk. Incarcerated people are going to come and repair it. Need the floor swept. An incarcerated person is going to sweep it. You need wax, an incarcerated person is going to wax it. Every single aspect of things that need to be done in a prison to keep the prisons functioning are done by incarcerated labor. And so this is what the 13th Amendment does. This is how it actually functions, right, in today's prison. Now, one of the things, and when we know this, and again, this is one of the things that bothers me sometimes, is when we know this and when we can point this out, my question becomes, why not change it, right? If you ask any citizen, you don't have to be an abolitionist, right? But you ask any person, do a survey, and you ask them, do you believe slavery should exist in the United States in any form, right? I'm willing to bet that the majority of people would say no, right? It shouldn't exist at all. And if that's your answer, right, that slavery shouldn't exist in America in any form, then I would ask you, then why not remove it from the laws that permits it? Why is it still in our laws? And so what we need to be doing, if you want to fix the problem in Alabama, we need to be pushing for a reform, right, of the 13th Amendment. And here I'm not saying an abolishment of the 13th Amendment, because that's what got rid of plantation slavery, but it needs to be reformed. And you need to remove the language out of it that permits slavery. If we don't agree with it, why not take any and all language out of any and all laws in this country that permits slavery in any and all ways? Why not just totally do away with it, right? So that becomes my question. So the 13th Amendment needs to be changed, right? Needs to be rewritten. Now, what happens if you rewrite the 13th Amendment and remove that exception clause? The reason our government is not going to do that, Congress is never going to change that 13th Amendment, is because they would be doing a disservice to prisons. If you remove that exception clause from the 13th Amendment, then it would no longer be permissible to pay a person $1 a day for slaving. That's a slave's wage. Now, with a newly written 13th Amendment that prohibits slavery in all forms, what happened is every incarcerated worker would have to be paid at least a minimum wage. And if you pay incarcerated workers at least a minimum wage, the person who plunged the toilet gets, in Massachusetts, the minimum wage is $15. So now you get $15 an hour. The person who sweeps the floor gets $15 an hour. The person who cooks the food, $15 an hour. What happens is this drastically increases the cost of incarceration, right? It'll cost far more money to incarcerate people because you have to pay for all that labor. Or you'll have to hire it. You'll have to hire that labor from outside if you don't want to pay the incarcerated people. So the cost of prisons will skyrocket to the point where they wouldn't be able to keep prisons running the way that they run today. And as an abolitionist, this would be perfect, because what'll happen is they'll try to dump this excess cost onto the taxpayer, and the taxpayer would be, stepped on so much that I believe the taxpayer, who are our everyday citizens, would be more open-minded to thinking about alternatives to prison. So that helps us, abolition-wise, to remove that exception clause from the 13th Amendment. But it's going way back to 1865, right? That's the very reason why we see these things happening today in Alabama. In Trump's first term, if you recall, there was wildfires going on in California. And what did Trump say? Trump said, well, why not have the inmates go put out the fires, right? We can do it. He wasn't lying. What Trump was looking at was the slave resource that the law permits. He's saying, listen, the law says we got slaves. Why not use our slaves, to go put out the fire? We have slaves. Why not use them? Right? And so that's what the law permits. So if you want to use the law, right, then, let's use our slaves, right? And so that's the importance of that 13th Amendment. Now, a final note to this discussion that I want to say is, sometimes people will say, oh, those things were in the past. That's all old. It doesn't happen anymore. And one of the things I want to say to you is that the language of the 13th Amendment is not rhetorical. It is not rhetorical. It's there for a purpose. It was strategically thought of. It was strategically written into the Constitution. It wasn't a mistake. They didn't mistakenly add that exception clause. That wasn't an accident. That was intentional. That was specific, right? That was thought out, it was discussed, and it was implemented. And so the 13th Amendment is not rhetorical. It has a function. And that exception clause today has a function. And that's what I just laid out for you, is the function of that exception clause. So, so let's move. If you really want to put together a serious move, let's move to change the language of the 13th Amendment. And then we don't have to deal with them forcing people to work in Alabama or anywhere else.